If you follow my channel, you know me as a purveyor of fountain pen reviews, art instruction, and things related to drawing and sketching. But I'm also a writer, illustrator of graphic novels and children's books, and in this video we're going to take a break from my usual blathering about fountain pens and drawing technique. Here's a children's book that I wrote a little while ago that I would like to illustrate and publish. It's about two little robot friends, Stanley and Decker, who live in a time when our planet is no longer occupied by people. One day, Decker falls ill, and Stanley goes on an adventure to save him. The story is part children's book, part parody, and part dark parable. I think it should be a super fun project full of weird-looking robots and even weirder post-apocalyptic futuristic landscapes. It's also something I'm absolutely certain that no traditional publisher would touch with a 10-foot pole. No matter, because I've decided for this children's book project, instead of going the wearisome, often dispiriting route of looking for a publisher, I'm going to do something bold and enterprising and publish it myself, and then create a series of videos detailing my entire work process for all to see. So, in this video series, and I'm not sure how many videos it will ultimately be, I'm going to show you how I develop my ideas, how I come up with the layout and design of the book, and then take you through all the steps required to create the final illustrations. Once the book is completed, I'll make a video where I'll read it to you, perhaps with some music and sound effects, and let you know where you can buy a physical copy. I realize that this is a departure from the fountain pen reviews and art instruction that I usually offer, but the process of making a book involves lots of drawing materials and techniques. And since this is a professional project done in the studio, the materials I'm going to use will be somewhat different than the portable sketching-oriented stuff that has been the primary focus of this channel. Most importantly, I think this will be of use to those that are thinking of creating a children's book but aren't really sure how to go about it. My hope is that this series of videos inspire all of you out there watching not to wait for the high lords of publishing to dictate when your work sees the light of day, and to take control over your creative life, self-publish, and get your stuff out there for people to see and enjoy. Let's get started with the very first step, which I call research and development. The research part involves gathering works of art and other imagery that will serve as inspiration for the appearance of your book. This is something that many writer-illustrators will already be thinking about during the writing process, but I tend to do it only after my book is completely written. Everyone has their own way of working. While some writer-illustrators come up with a look for their story first and then develop the story around it, I tend to work with the story first before delving into the visuals. Over the years, I've discovered that I work better that way, and in fact, I don't think of myself as an illustrator when I write and try to create a story that stands on its own without pictures. Once I'm done with the story, I pass it over to my illustrator self, who will look at the manuscript and edit it in places where the illustrations make the text redundant. But we're getting ahead of ourselves, because right now the only task at hand is to gather up images that will serve as my visual inspiration. While this is a story intended for children, it contains some subtle dark elements, jokes, and additional layers of meaning that will be noticed by adults. Despite those dark elements, I wanted the book to have a quirky, fun look to it. For that, I looked to the pulpy science fiction illustration from the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. I really love the slightly flattened graphic quality of these illustrations, as well as their lurid, garish color schemes, and the fact that despite the supposedly serious subject matter, these illustrations don't take themselves too seriously. For my inspiration for the robots, I also looked to toys from the same time period. Though these robot toys predate my own childhood by at least 2 decades, I feel a strong sense of nostalgia when looking at them. I also really like the clumsy and impractical look of these robots, like they would be completely useless for any real task, and would just crash into walls and break everything. They're a perfect fit for the feel of my book, which pokes fun at the science fiction genre and its obsession with cool-looking technology. My robots will definitely not be cool-looking. They're going to look like they were built by a demented toy maker from the 1950s. Another source of inspiration comes from the paintings of the 19th century British painter John William Mallard Turner, who is famous for his incredibly poetic and atmospheric landscapes. Turner's glowing depictions of sunsets, streaked through with acidic oranges, blood reds, and piercing yellows, were inspired by the massive volcanic eruption of Mount Tambora in 1815, which spewed volcanic ash into the atmosphere, triggering extreme climate events around the globe. Since my book is set in a post-apocalyptic Earth, which I imagine to be filled with noxious gases, I think Turner's paintings will be a great inspiration, particularly for the color palettes. The story takes place through the course of one day and night, so I envision the palette changing as the sun rises in the morning, is directly overhead at noon, and sets with the moon taking over. All of the images I gather go into a series of folders on my computer that I will constantly consult as I work on the book. I will also continue gathering, so that by the time I'm through, this library of references and inspirational images will run into the hundreds. I like to keep these files strictly organized so that I'm able to quickly access them as I'm working. Having a big folder of references and inspirations is invaluable, and I strongly recommend that you do it. Creativity doesn't happen in a vacuum, in an empty room with blank walls. It occurs by feeding your brain, by looking at a lot of art and the world around you. When doing your research, keep an open mind. You're not making final decisions here, just gathering things that might be useful. Once you have a better idea of what you want to do, you can gather even more images to use as specific reference material. For now, the only requirement is that the image be inspiring. If it is, and it goes into the visual research folder. Now that I'm done with my visual research, I'm going to start on the visual development stage. This is where I start sketching and develop the look of my characters and the world they inhabit. When coming up with character ideas, there are a few things that I need to take into account. The main consideration is that the characters need to reflect the overall tone of the book. This is a children's book with a dark twist, so while I need to make the robots appealing to children, they can't be too cute. Furthermore, since I'm poking fun at the science fiction genre, I also want to make them very goofy looking. However, if they're too goofy looking, they won't be compelling, so I want to make sure that they're full of interesting surfaces, textures, as well as semi-realistic mechanisms. Not only do the designs need to reflect the distinct personalities of the characters, they also must be distinct from each other so that they're easily identifiable by the reader. However, if your characters are too different from each other, the book will lack a cohesive style, so we need to make sure the characters are different, but not look like they belong in entirely different stylistic universes. So, they have to be childlike, but not too childlike. They have to be goofy, but not too goofy, and they have to be different from each other, but not too different. In some ways, illustration feels like an engineering problem, which requires you to strike a balance between conflicting forces. And, as with all engineering problems, the development stage starts with a bunch of prototypes. Once I've fed my brain by looking at toy robots, robot illustrations from the 1950s, and also modern factory robots, I do a bunch of quick concept sketches where I explore the possibilities. These are relatively rough, and I usually don't bother inking them, but in this case I ink them to make them clearer for this tutorial. Here are my prototypes for Stanley, who really is the hero of the story. I think the idea on the top left is friendly looking, with a large childlike head and a pear-like body with splayed out duck-like feet. This one is a funny, interesting direction. The second one on the top right is inspired by old diving gear. I like how this character has a large head and a tiny face, like he's speaking through a hole in a wall. Again, the idea here is to make the character very awkward looking, and this one, with its stubby little fingers, definitely communicates that. The robot on the bottom left looks very silly and friendly, half turtle, half clumsy toddler. I don't know, perhaps he's a little bit too simple. I want these robots to be less streamlined and more clunky. This one looks too much like a toy idea. The fourth one is an iteration of the first with a few refinements, and that's actually an important part of this process. I usually start with quite a few different ideas, and then, once I've found something I like, I start working in that direction by doing variations of it. That creates a creative direction that allows me to hone in on the final idea. Creativity is actually a process of narrowing. You start off with a lot of options, you choose one option, and then explore the possibilities within that option. Once you've chosen one of the possibilities, you refine it until you finally arrive at an idea. If you keep opening up new pathways instead of narrowing your options, you'll never get anywhere. Here's the final sketch of Stanley the Robot. This concept might change a little bit as I work on the book, but I think he strikes a balance between a big-headed goofball that looks like he's going to trip over his feet, who's also neat-looking with a glass dome revealing the circuitry inside, and little crab-like eyes that can shift in all directions. Decker is another nerdy character, and I wanted him to be frail-looking, since he's the one that Stanley rescues. So all of these sketches feature geeky, oversized glasses and a metal plate on his head that resembles a bowl cut with a part in the middle. The first three ideas are not bad, with funny-looking protruding ears and buck teeth. But after I drew these, I realized that I'm making him too broad-shouldered and brawny, and that I can make him look more delicate by dropping the shoulders down and making him knock-kneed, which is what I did in the sketch on the bottom right. Here's the final design. I think the suspenders and the pocket protector details are a nice touch. The last main character in the book is Ryobi, who is an elderly robot that works in a scrapyard. The first sketch on the top left is completely off character, looking more like a monkey dressed for a carnival. Then I think I gradually honed in on it, making the character increasingly more squat with knobby arthritic hands. This character has to be elderly, but also very strong, like a Russian babushka, an iron-willed granny who can bake cookies but would rather rebuild an engine. And here are sketches for our bad guys. These are scavenger robots who dwell in the Forbidden Zone. They don't have names in the narrative, but let's just call them Sweetie, Fluffy, and Buttercup. I like the first three designs, based on skeletons and deep-sea fish, but I think they're too fancy looking. These might work for a story about barbarian war robots, but these guys live on the outskirts of society and need to look much more hardscrabble. The design for the main villain, however, feels pretty spot on. The spider-like legs, the toothed pincers, and the creepy child-like smiley face with a popped-out eye, all these things make for a very creepy, nasty-looking character. Here's the final sketch for the main villain, Mikata. I decided to raise up the smile a little, giving her more chin. I think that's a nice touch, reminiscent of that Forever Alone face meme of the early 2000s. Not being satisfied with the designs for Sweetie, Fluffy, and Buttercup, I decided to revise the scavenger bots, and here are some more concepts. This is a much more ragtag crew with a lot of asymmetrical features and mix and match parts. The top three I think would work very well with their barbarian helmets, but I feel like they're not as original as they could be. I find myself drawn to the two characters on the bottom, one with little protruding crab eyes, another one with eyes on the side like a hammerhead shark. Both are interesting, creepy looking designs that I think might work better for this book. The last two characters are minor roles and will probably not be in any more than 1 or 2 illustrations, but I decided to go through the prototype process anyway. This one is a store-bought, essentially a sleazy salesman type. I'm not entirely sure, but I think I'll go with the one on the top right because I really like his chomper-like teeth and those 2 plates over a bald head imitating a comb-over. I also like how his body looks like a cheap suit from the 1970s. And lastly, this character is a repair bot. I struggled with this one, perhaps because I couldn't decide on who this character was supposed to be exactly, which, going back to the idea of creativity being about narrowing options, was a problem, because it opened up way too many possibilities. The one on the top left is a slow-witted lumbering sort. The one below him is some kind of twisty, spastic flea-like creature with lots of twitchy arms. But I finally settled on him being a skateboard guy with a sideways cap, a hoodie, and a soul patch. Okay, here are my cast of characters. In larger projects, I tend to spend more time developing them, trying different options and trying as best as I can to think like a casting agent by asking myself, how well does the actor portray the character that I want? How different is this character from the others? And lastly, are they fun and absolutely goofy looking? The next step in the visual development process is to decide what materials and techniques will be used to make the book. While some artists will use the same methods over and over, I love to change up how I work based on what will best serve the requirements of the project. And since my projects are usually very different from each other, my way of working tends to vary a lot. I enjoy being a chameleon and switching up my style. For example, this children's book about trolls required a lot of dark, romantic-looking landscapes, so I went with a traditional oil painting technique. Whereas this graphic novel is set in ancient Greece, so I used acrylic paint and a complicated painting surface preparation that made the illustrations look like the ancient frescoes of Pompeii. And then there's this project inspired by film noir and German expressionism, where I chose a dry media technique to make the illustrations look like grainy film stills from the early 1900s. Deciding what media to use is usually a fairly drawn-out process involving a lot of experimentation. For me, this is also one of the more interesting steps. The great thing about being a practicing artist for 25 years is that I've accumulated a lot of art supplies, different papers, paint, pencils, pens, inks, etc. Having all these things on hand allows me to do a lot of experimentation. I love to put on my mad scientist hat and tinker with my art supplies and try to come up with some new, exciting method. Based on the initial visual research that I had done, I knew I wanted the book to have an overall retro look like something from a 1950s science fiction magazine. I also wanted something very dark and atmospheric, something that conveyed the hazy, polluted environment of a post-apocalyptic Earth. The first option I decided to try was a very traditional-looking pen and ink and watercolor technique with a few twists to make it look like an old science fiction magazine cover. I'm using a very smooth multimedia paper here, but if I do end up going in this direction, I'll probably switch to hot press illustration board. For most studio projects, I rely on my trusty dip pen, but since I want to try something new, I'm using 2 of my favorite fountain pens, the Pilot Falcon Soft Fine and the Pilot 912 FA, both filled with waterproof black ink made by Noodlers. The 2 pens have flexible nibs that allow me to vary the lines as much as I would with a dip pen, and they're super convenient. The 912 FA is very flexible and has a line that pushes towards medium, whereas the Falcon has a finer line with a little bit less flexibility. My plan is to use the FA for the characters and the Falcon to render background details. If you'd like to know more about these pens, I have full reviews of them on my channel. Look for those videos in my fountain pen information playlist. My usual rendering technique involves putting down many layers of fine cross-hatched lines, but this style is not graphic enough and too busy for a children's book project, so I've decided to switch to an inking technique influenced by pen and ink illustration from the 1950s. The inking is very restrained here, mostly used to render the core shadows that separate the direct light from the secondary light. I imagine that the illustrations will employ 2 light sources, a direct light coming from the sun or moon, and some kind of eerie secondary light with a very dramatic saturated color. Now for the twist. The colors in those science fiction magazine covers were often very saturated, but the inexpensive printing technology of the time made the shadows very muted and gray. To imitate this effect, I decided to go over my drawing with washes of indelible gray ink called Lexington Gray. This allows me to build the forms to make the highlights look super bright and shiny and give the colors in the shadows a gray tone. I could have used a dilution of Noodler's Black, but Lexington Gray, which by the way is also made by Noodler's, has more color complexity to it, being composed of a few different pigments, and its lighter value allows for more control. Once the Lexington Gray layer was completed, I applied the watercolor layer, again with a twist. I chose highly transparent colors that were similar in color to the ones in printing ink. I think this combination of gray underpainting with a transparent layer of watercolor on top approximates the retro look I'm going for. Plus, I'm going to do some Photoshop filtering to give the image an even stronger vintage quality. By the way, playing with your image in Photoshop is not only a very fun thing to do, but a great way to experiment with different looks. By tinkering with the saturation, contrast, and also trying a bunch of different filters, you can easily experiment with a large number of different visual styles. Perhaps the illustration could look like this, or like this, or like this. Through the magic of Photoshop, hundreds of possibilities can easily present themselves. Now, what do I think of this? Well, it's better than my first attempt, where I used rough pressed watercolor paper with a bit less hatching and some white watercolor to indicate highlights. The rough paper is nice to work on, and I like the color scheme, but this image looks a little more Victorian than mid-20th century to me. It's also better than this, my second attempt, where I used a more hurried, built-up hatching method and a different multimedia paper that took the watercolor very unevenly. It's not a bad style, and I like the expressive Turner-esque nature of the background and the expressive hurried hatching, and the dramatic solid blacks, but it looks a little more like a 60s psychedelic image to me and lacks that 1950s graphic quality. As I said, when doing material experimentation, prepare for failure. Here's a completely different approach. I took some rough watercolor paper and applied a coat of gray gesso, made by mixing black paint into regular white gesso. Again, since I wanted a more muted effect with a lot of gray in the shadows, I first painted everything in monochrome. In order to increase the transparency of the paint and to help with the adhesion of the layers, I mixed some gesso into my titanium white. I like the rough watercolor paper for this illustration here because it allows me to exploit the texture. By the way, this method of doing a monochrome underpainting before applying color is a very old one, being used by the old masters. It allows me to separate the problem of value and color, making both tasks easier. I'm not really trying to make a nice painting here, by the way, and haven't bothered to make a sketch or work out the details in the background. Mostly this is just an exploration of the possibilities of this technique. Should I decide to go further in this direction, the technique might be refined further, but for now the point is to go far enough in the process so I can make an educated decision about what media and method to choose. Okay, here are the little paintings I did to decide on the materials. This is a tough decision, but I think I'm going to go with the acrylic. As much as I like to work in pen and ink, I think acrylic more effectively conveys that 1950s retro feel I was looking for, and is more effective in getting those really moody atmospheric effects. We'll leave pen and ink for another project and another day. Now that the visual research and development stages of my project are completed, I'm ready to move on to the next stage, which is the breakdown of the manuscript into pages and then compositional studies for each page. This for me is a very difficult stage and not nearly as fun as the visual development. But it's absolutely crucial to the success of the book. Since this video is already getting pretty long, however, we're going to leave that process to the next video in the series. Though I'm already working on this stage, that video will likely not come until next year, sometime in January of 2022. Thanks for watching, and as always, if you have any questions or comments, leave them below, and I'll be happy to respond.